On blinkers. Blinkers are something we don't see very often now, but I remember seeing them in my childhood. When you saw a horse pulling a wagon or something like that, it often had something, a sort of device on its head made of leather, which meant that it could only see straight ahead. Everything else was excluded. And I have always assumed that's so that it would not be distracted or frightened by things it saw out of the corner of its eye and shy and cause trouble. So it keeps your attention focused, but it means you miss much of the world. And I've always thought of that metaphor in relation to much of the work in the fields which I'm familiar with, anthropology and history, because looking at others, and of course you can never see the blinkers that you wear, you can see the blinkers on other people's faces, as Jesus pointed out with the idea of look to the beam in your own eyes before you start looking at the mote in other people's eyes. But we can't see it, but we can see it in others. And I've come across a number of cases where I thought, how extraordinary. I mean, one of them was a well-known American historian, Wallace Notestein, who convinced himself that from portraits that no one before the 19th century was complex and subtle and deeply emotionally conflicted and so on. They were just simple black and white cardboard figures until the 19th century, and he was a 17th century specialist. And when asked about Shakespeare and his plays, he said, oh, well, I think possibly he was just an invention of the 19th century and projected back, smuggled back. How ridiculous can you get? Another example is David Hockney, the artist who wrote a big book about why the Renaissance occurred. And he said there was a secret device invented in the 15th century in Italy which allowed you to draw in true perspective, and it was in all the workrooms of 15th century artists, but no one ever mentioned it, none of the apprentices or the artists or the people who wrote on how you did art or anything like that. And so for about 3 or 4 centuries it was completely taboo to mention this until David Hockney discovered it in the second half of the 20th century. Well, can anything more be more ridiculous than that? Or another example, several of my esteemed colleagues, Lawrence Stone and Edward Shorter, have argued that people before the 18th century really had no feelings towards their children or towards each other. Romantic love was an invention of the 18th century. People didn't care about their children because they would die anyway. And so human sentiment is dating from the last 2 centuries. Well, anyone who's read any of the material before the 18th century surely can see in the poetry of great poets or in letters or many sources that this is complete and utter rubbish. So how do you have these blinkers? Well, I think it's to do with specialization, and it's also to do with the fact that once you become distinguished in a certain field, then people can't criticize you and tell you what you're doing is nonsense. It's the emperor's new clothes syndrome, and it's very dangerous. In many fields, you become above criticism. My great good fortune is to have a very honest critic very close to me, namely my wife, Sarah, because obviously it's difficult for her. I get into irritated bouts of depression if she criticizes me too much, and she knows she may be hurting me, but she is ruthlessly honest and direct, and if she thinks my ideas are not working, and she's read most of my works, and she tells me what's wrong with it, and this has saved me from many errors and delusions without doubt. So what you get is that in any profession, high up that profession, whether it's lawyers or doctors, teachers, a blinkering effect. And so this is something we should be constantly aware of. Thank you.